Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. Controlling the narrative, a new tactic for auditors and ALJs. Brian, that's a great title because we're talking about physician narrative. So how quippy of you.
I try every time. I try to make these titles punchy. You got to get those the downloads and not the views. What are they? The listens, the downloads for the podcast?
Yeah, downloads.
Clickbait. Yeah. I got a career in clickbait if this attorney thing doesn't work out.
Yeah, in this really niche-y area. But we won't let your head get too big. So we're talking narratives and certification. So the two most common, I think, denials are not maybe new to people, but are worth, because they're so persistent, worth talking about some new developments and documentation issues around them. So one is they're saying the medical record doesn't support a 6-month prognosis, and then getting a sort of technical denial on the physician narrative where it's saying the narrative is insufficient. Like, we have had cases where they say the patient is eligible, but the physician narrative is insufficient. I mean, that's a little bit more rare, but it does happen. But what's the new stuff you wanted to share here, Brian?
Well, yeah, the typical version of this narrative sufficiency, we've been able to address and be successful by pointing out the regulations that say, judge or auditor, you might be expecting too much of these narratives. They've got to be brief. They got to reflect the patient's clinical circumstances, and they can't include check boxes. Other than that, it's pretty much up to the physician. The new twist on this that we have begun to see.
And Brian, maybe just to put the zinger in here, when they created the rule, and at the end of the rule, they have to say how much, should this cost you to implement? This should take less than 5 minutes or whatever is in the actual rule, which is something we use to get at what the brevity is. Because, right, you have to review the documentation, prepare it, and they're saying this should take 5 minutes, right? To say that there should be, paragraphs and paragraphs or, whatever they're looking for. But anyway, just to add some color. And I think that's important because I think this new twist is kind of taking the position of the government into the direction of requiring more and more and more that really stretches the regulations and CMS's intent really beyond to an absurd level. So the new twist is we have auditors focusing on the word explanation that is included in the regulation. It's called a narrative explanation. And then for the third and later benefit periods, there's a reference to the narrative must include an explanation as to how the clinical findings from the face-to-face support a terminal prognosis. And so what we've seen is really a demand that you don't just kind of identify a series of clinical factors and even note increasing weakness, FAST score decreased. But apparently they think that there should also be a section of the narrative that includes more of an explanation. Exactly what they're looking for, I don't know. And whether they're thinking this is a sentence or paragraph after paragraph, also unclear. I don't think it's really a standard that they can define very well. And I don't think it's a standard that appears in the regulations. It becomes subjective, Brian. I mean, it's but this isn't enough. And it's but I am the actor, and you're asking me what is in my head, thinking about why I think this person is eligible. I mean, to then have a third party say, but that's not what was in your head, or that's not, I don't know. It gets very sort of entwined and circular, and I don't know why you're going to deny a claim on a technical issue for a narrative. I mean, it just seems.
Yeah, and I think to a lot of us who have, a lot of experience in the hospice space, when you start describing a lot of those clinical conditions and how they've evolved and changed over time, the explanation is self-evident. That is the explanation. Why is this patient ineligible for hospice? Well, their FAST went from a 7A to a 7B, and their PPS is down. So what do you mean explanation? This is the explanation. but we wanted to raise it in this podcast because I think it's a new way of trying to look at the regulatory language to increase the burden on hospices. So not only do you need to have the clinical findings, but you need to have this separate explanation, as if those clinical findings were not explanation enough. We have encountered some ALJs who appear to be buying into this because they will kind of go with that argument. I think there's some language in the regulations or the rule commentary about the physician really needs to justify why the patient is eligible. And so they lay out all these new words as if these are now new requirements for a narrative. Well, now it needs to justify, it needs to explain in ways that hospices really haven't ever been doing, I think, for the reasons you and I described. It's, the mind reader problem, the self-evident nature of this. So it remains unclear what the expectations are from these auditors. And I think, like to your point, Meg, what is the standard? I don't think they could define a standard, or at least they haven't defined one yet, about what is an appropriate explanation. There may be language to include in a narrative that can be preemptive of this kind of argument, and just to make some sort of further explanation in a narrative. I'm not saying this is required by the regulations. It's kind of like playing the auditor's game. You want an explanation, okay, we'll add something. And if you wanted to include something in a narrative along the lines of the face-to-face, the clinical findings of the face-to-face encounter support this patient's 6-month prognosis because ... And maybe having that kind of a sentence as a prompt for a physician to complete with a clause or a sentence or two, at least you can then point back to that and say, there's an explanation. Again, I think we still have sound arguments about, the data is the explanation. But just to try to get out in front of what these auditors and a few ALJs are deciding, that might be a good proactive step you can take.
Well, and, not letting your foot off the gas in terms of expectation setting with physicians about, this is like one of the most important pieces of documentation in the medical record. It's going to be Exhibit 1, and if this isn't stellar, like it makes it a steeper climb for the rest of it. So I think the larger conversation we've had on this podcast about hire physicians who want to do this job well, that aren't just looking for, some extra money, but are committed to this area and committed to what's expected and standards of care and stuff. Because the days are long past that, we're doing great work and great services, but none of this other, it's like, yes, all of that stuff matters, but you don't want to have to argue about it, right? There was a great compliance officer that I worked with who I said, you want to be in the middle of the road. It's not that you're not right, but who wants to have to argue about it? Like, Brian, who wants to go to federal court, to prove your point? It's like trying to make it as most self-evident as you can.
Well, right. I mean, we can win some of these arguments, but you don't want to have to be in a position to win an argument. You want to avoid the argument at the outset. And that's kind of what this suggested language may help you do. And there's a lot of ways you can take similar steps in other areas that we've talked about through these podcasts and when we talk with clients. So better to avoid the battle and get paid than to stand on principle and have to spend a lot of money to fight for it.
Yeah. And I think that physicians are so used to doing electronic charting and writing notes. And so, it's not like you're asking them to push a boulder up a mountain. But I also think maybe the last thing to end on and I think it's a theme throughout a lot of our podcasts when we talk about audit preparedness, is understanding the context. Like here, this is painting the context, but for the auditor, because they're never going to see this patient. All they're going to look at is these documents in isolation, and sort of everything needs to be stand on its own. But also for the actor as the physician, they need to understand the perspective of who are they documenting for. And that's sort of rule one when we do documentation training, is getting people to understand who they're documenting for, which is not themselves. It's not, I would say not even a clinician always, right? I mean, it is to someone who really has very little knowledge. And so I think continuing to build that context and perspective, I think helps people document better. It's like the kind of conversation you would have with another doctor about a patient is totally different than how you, or should be different than the bedside manner you would have to explain someone's medical condition to them, like a lay person. And that's sort of what this is, explaining to a lay person, why this person is eligible for hospice. So, but anyway, it's never ending, Brian. Never ending.
I know. Keeps us busy, but it can be frustrating sometimes, and we feel for the hospices that have to go through it, but we are here to help.
Yep. To no end, Brian.
Yep.
So, but anyway, all right. Well, until next time, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Meg.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.